most research that we've seen and most studies that we've seen from around the world show that most consumers can't tell the difference between best before and use by and use them interchangeably.
So welcome to another episode of Food Waste Matters, and I'm Dr. Joanne Freeman, your host from Honey and Fox. For those of you that are new to our podcast, Food Waste Matters is dedicated to showcasing the stories and the solutions that address a really important issue of our time, and that is food waste. With an estimated 7.6 million tonnes of food wasted annually in Australia alone, the impact of this on our environment and our economy is just staggering. So Food Waste Matters is all about highlighting those who are making a difference, whether through innovation, education, research, or local community initiatives. And in this episode, I'm pleased to welcome Associate Professor Lukas Parker from RMIT University in Melbourne. So Lukas is a social marketing and behaviour change specialist with 2 decades of experience in social and behaviour change research. He's published 6 books and over 100 research publications. In recent years, he has focused on understanding how and why consumers waste food and exploring ways to facilitate household food waste reduction. He's also a member of End Food Waste Australia and has been leading the National Date Labelling and Storage Advice Project, which is the focus for this episode. So good morning and welcome to Food Waste Matters, Lukas, and thanks so much for joining us today. So first up, can you give me an overview of your research, how it came about, and why is labelling and storage advice so important?
Well, there's a lot to unpack with all of those questions, pardon the pun. But when we're looking at packaging, we've been looking at packaging for the last 5 years as part of our research, but more recently looking at best before and use by and storage advice instructions. And part of that is recognizing that consumers are one part of the food waste problem, and it's around 1/3 of the food waste happens at the household level. But I also think it's really important for us to realize that a lot of the food waste that happens at the household level is not necessarily our fault and our individual's fault, because everybody has a part to play in that food waste space, and retailers and companies that are producing food need to be able to help people to make better decisions so that they can prolong the life of their food, because we don't want people throwing away good food, and we don't need to throw away good food, but there's a lot of confusion out there, and our research has shown that there is confusion about existing labels, but also just how to deal with food more generally.
So talking about this confusion, Lukas,
Mm-hmm.
what do you mean? What sort of confusion is out there?
Well, the big one that has led for what this project is the classic problem, and I say classic because it's not just Australia that has this problem, it's everywhere. We have 2 main labels that we deal with, and those are best before and use by, and they're terribly confusing because they give you a date, and we look at that date and we say, well, that date is the date that the food expires, and people throw away, sometimes not meaning to, throw away good food. And the thing is about best before and use by, is that they have different meanings, and we need to be clearer about those.
So be clearer for us.
I will be clear. So use by is a very straightforward one. Use by means that you should follow it or you must follow it. It's a health and safety label. It's by no means perfect. I mean, we've all bought milk before that's got a use by date and it's gone off before that use by date. But a use by date you should not eat after that date. It's a health and safety one. Best before is about quality. and quality is a really difficult thing to measure. And it's about, the food is of its optimum quality before that best before date. But we don't actually have to throw the food away after that date. Food that is after its best before date is still usually, and in most circumstances, fine to eat after that date, as long as it's not damaged, deteriorated, or perished. And what that means is, as consumers, is we've got to make a decision ourselves. And a lot of that is looking at the packaging or smelling the food or tasting the food. And we're unlikely to cause any harm to ourselves by doing it. And in fact, in Australia, we can still get food and we can buy food after those dates for a best before. Use by is the other, which is the health and safety one, and I would never ever advise about eating it. But one of the problems that we have when we're looking at best before is that it's used on so many different products, and therefore it actually makes it very difficult for consumers. So, for instance, you look at one of the most difficult products that I think for best before is I've got rock salt at home, Himalayan rock salt. It's a mineral, and it was taken from the earth, and it's a stable mineral, yet it's got a best before date. And so when we look at that, we see a date and we look at the date and we go, well, it's best before this date. That means after this date, it's not the best. And we all want the best for our families. And therefore, we may be tempted to throw something out. And all of those sorts of things. And there's other reasons why people throw away food, but that's one of the ones that we're there. And it's one of the reasons why we're focused pretty heavily on that at the moment.
I know I certainly have been guilty of throwing away food that's, that has a best before date on it. So, Lukas, can you tell me who determines the best before and the use by date? Where does that happen in the supply chain?
So the best before is chosen by the companies, and they can choose where they want it to be. It's a difficult one to measure, and so I don't go into a lot of detail in our own research on it, because we just work to the fact that there is best before labels on different products. But it is a useful piece of information, particularly for retailers. So if we think about when we're buying things at retailers, they've got dozens of products that are coming in from all over the world, and they've got the best before dates, and they're needing to be able to rotate their stock so that they're ensuring that they reduce their food waste inside retailers, because they want to get their older stock out first and then bring in the newer stock. And that's what we do. But then we also know that consumers, as part of that, and I do it myself, is we go into the store and you put your hand behind the shelf to try and pick the newer product from behind. So we use best before in those ways. But we also use best before in our own planning in our household as well, which is where we've got best before in our refrigerator. We've got products with best before, and we use that to manage our own food at home. And they can be really incredibly useful for that sort of stuff, because we can make sure that we eat all of the older stuff first before we go into the newer stuff. But those dates overall are really difficult, because particularly when we go back to that idea of use by, and I know that I'm being conscious here that I'm jumping between use by and best before, but I will say it's a problem with both best before and use by, is that they are there and they are assuming that we've had the food go through its optimum storage and treatment and transportation throughout the process. But what we do find and it's regular, that we have breaks in cold chain at different points, or where food is moved from one cabinet to another and then it's not being kept at the coolest possible temperature at different points in time. Or if we're looking at it in terms of where we are in Australia, I mean, you're in Tasmania and I'm in Melbourne, we tend not to have too much trouble with keeping food, particularly that food that is that we need to keep on shelves fresh. But in states where we've got humidity or higher humidity, trying to look at those dates is not necessarily the same as what it might be for Melbourne. So they're never ever perfect, but we like the simplicity as human beings because it takes one decision away from us when we see a date.
And I was just thinking as you were saying that in different states, but even in different regions, in those more remote regions where they don't get food delivery every day or even every week, that use by date or best before becomes a real challenge for them.
Absolutely. And look, it's that thing. And so I look at it when I'm looking at date labels, and I've spent so much time focusing on those 6 and 8 digit codes. But when we're looking at those codes, is that they are useful and they are really helpful for us, and particularly for those in busy households. And our research sort of shows this when we're looking at it, the way that people use it. The problem is that if we treat them too literally, particularly when I'm saying best before, we can actually end up throwing away good food. And that's the problem. And you mentioned that you've done it before. I've done it before. And part of that process, and I think as humans, I really think that when we look at food waste, we all need to think about it as ourselves. And the first step is we've got to admit that we all sometimes throw away good food. We don't mean to. No one ever means to. But unless we actually recognize that we all do it, then we can't actually resolve the problem ourselves. And that's what I would say is with best before, is sometimes I do it and I don't mean to. But humans are not always the most rational, even us academics.
So, Lukas, during your research, you interviewed 125 Australian consumers. What was and we've talked about some of them already, but what were some of the key challenges they faced in regards to this use by date or best before date?
Well, our data roughly showed what we knew in terms of the actual behaviors with best before and understandings of best before and use by. Most research that we've seen and most studies that we've seen from around the world show that most consumers can't tell the difference between best before and use by and use them interchangeably. Our sample, because we're doing something that's qualitative, so we're discussing and people are getting a chance to clarify their points. Most people, when we found that, we got about just over 50% of people could tell us what use by was and what best before was. But then when we dug a bit deeper, in most circumstances, we found that they still use the terms interchangeably. So they saw a date and it made it simple. But it's not as clear cut for everything. It's dependent on categories of food as well. So there are some things people are not so concerned about, but there are real categories, particularly ones that people saw as riskier. That's where they would be a little bit more likely to follow a date. So to clarify a bit about our research, we did 125 interviews. And in interviews, that's a really large figure because normally we talk about surveys, but these are interviews of 1 hour each. And each of those interviews, they talked about two product categories. And our product categories that we were focusing on were meat and fish, which is one, dairy and eggs, which was the second category. Then we had fruit and vegetables. Then we had bakery and baked goods like breads and crumpets and all of those sorts of things. And then we had shelf-stable type things, so things that you tend to find in the center of the supermarket. And part of that was we suspected that there would be differences between the different types of categories, and there were, but we also found within categories there were differences. So the one when we were looking at milk, and milk is part of dairy, people really, when we were looking at milk, were more likely to follow the dates for milk, whereas they were more likely to be a little bit more lenient with yogurt because they felt more comfortable making a decision. And then when we looked at eggs, we found the majority of people weren't even looking at the use by or not the use by, the best before. See, even I make that mistake before sometimes. Best before for eggs, which is interesting. And look, we're all different individually. And I know for me, I'm funny with eggs. I actually do look at the best before. And that's because I live in a small household and I don't eat that many eggs. So therefore, I have that date there as a reminder. But then also for me, it's learning about testing those things. So seeing if they float in water is that classic way to test whether those eggs are good. But back to my point was we found that there's differences in categories. So meat and fish, people were really cautious on, which is understandable, high risk. Bread, people tended to make a decision and often weren't even looking at those dates. But for shelf stable ones, people were confused, and in some categories they would use them, and in others they weren't using it. And that's where we were looking at those dates overall. They were getting them a bit mixed up.
So, Lukas, was there any difference in in demographics with
Yes.
positions?
Yeah, look, and I hesitate, and I'm going to do my academic bit of caution with the data. The qualitative data is really great, and it tells us a lot about those 125 people. And our sample that we got, those 125 people, was a really diverse sample. We got people from every single state in the country. We included people that were from different backgrounds in terms of diversity. So we made sure that we had different people with disabilities. We looked at culturally and linguistically diverse people, but we also had an age breakdown and a gender breakdown that was somewhat similar or commensurate to what we have in the country. But when we were looking at it overall, what we tended to find was that older consumers were more confident with dates. And when I say more confident with dates, they were more likely to make a decision about whether they would use a product beyond the date. Whereas when we were looking at younger households, so your typical young couple where they've got young children, they were more likely to follow the dates religiously. So they would see the date and they would stick to the date and throw things out. And that, for us, those two findings were not particularly surprising because when we were looking at younger people, they're really busy. They're trying to manage often two people working. They're looking at trying to feed a family. They're worrying about their children. They're just really busy. And so having a date there, and what we found when we were asking them was, even if they knew the difference between the dates, they liked the idea of the date there because it took a decision away from them. It was really clear for them. They just throw it out. And the point that I sort of made before that sort of appeared within those findings was that people said, I want the best for my family. And if it's best before that date, then it is best for my family. And then after that date, then it's not the best, and I want the best for my family. And so you can see where that word comes across, that it actually is causing people that difficulty. But also what we found, and our study isn't just looking at best before, it's looking at storage advice and telling people how to do that. We found that younger audiences found it really important for them to have clear instructions about how to best store the food to prolong its life, whereas the older people who were interviewed were more likely to feel confident enough to make the decisions themselves and felt comfortable about using freezer to prolong the life of their food, even beyond those dates. They were more confident to make the decisions about food based on their sensory testing, so the fancy words we use for sniff, taste, touch, or look at. They felt more comfortable to do that, whereas our younger audiences often felt like that they weren't as confident to be able to do that. And of course, that's not for everybody, but it was a larger group of people within our younger groups that were more likely to think that.
So, Lukas, I read in your report that you came up with some really great and practical solutions, and I emphasise that word practical, to minimise this confusion around labelling. So what were some of those solutions?
Sure. Look, we see labeling as that one key point where it's helpful to have when they're making the decisions at their home. I don't want to overstate, though, the importance of labels, because labels are just one part of many different things that need to be done to help people. But the term that we use, our academic phrasing is behavioral infrastructure. So giving people the infrastructure to be able to make better decisions. And some of those things came across were that people wanted, when we were looking at storage advice, was telling people where to store things, telling people how to freeze or whether the product is able to be frozen. If it is able to be frozen, how cold it needs to be frozen at, how long it can be kept in a freezer for a period, and how to properly thaw the food. So people wanted quite explicit instructions. And we also found that in terms of storage, it was very variable across states, because one of those standard phrases that we tend to see across a lot of product categories is store in a cool, dry place. And that really is quite unclear for a lot of people, especially as I was talking about before, in humid places. Well, often that is a refrigerator is the only cool, dry place, but even there can feel quite damp when you put things in a refrigerator. So that can be quite confusing. So people wanted information that was really quite specific. What we also found was when people didn't have really clear or specific information was we couldn't rely on the fact that information might be passed on through generations. I think a lot of what our expectations are is that we assume that knowledge is passed on intergenerationally. But what we found is that it isn't. And that's because we've got lots of different diverse audiences from lots of different backgrounds. And if we're looking at our diets are often very different to what our parents are. So we're using foods that are different. I think in my household, I use garlic a lot, but my parents don't use garlic. So storage of garlic, I had to learn myself. And we're looking at even households where they don't typically have a bread-based diet, not knowing that freezing is an option for bread is something that's quite common. Or at the other end of the spectrum, for those people who are not familiar with rice and not sure how to reheat rice beyond after you've cooked it. And what most of us do is we use Google, or what we found, which was a little bit concerning from our work, was that they were relying on social media to get that information. So TikTok and using life hacks and things. And whilst some of those hacks and ideas are good, they are really useful because they can show you really great things. The problem is that sometimes these people who are providing this advice are not equipped or knowledgeable or authorities to be able to give you advice, particularly about we saw people that were getting confused about use by, which, as I said, is a word that I say that is a non-negotiable date, but actually telling people that it is negotiable. And therefore, we actually get that confusion that was happening. So when we were looking at our work overall, what we were finding was that people wanted explicit instructions so that they could move on. What we also found, which is this conundrum that we have, is that whilst they felt that there was not enough information, often when they were looking at packaging, there was too much information. There's just so much. If you look on the back of a package of anything that you've got in your household, there's dozens of disclaimers. There's lots of bits and pieces of information. So actually trying to find the information you need is really hard. And it's actually trying to work out what is useful for people at different points in time. And so what we're using with this data and what as part of our project is that we're using these insights to develop some new concepts for best before and storage and use by date. So different types of labeling. We've developed those different types of labels, and we're now testing those with different audiences to see what are the different sorts of problems. So understanding it from a consumer's perspective, but also understanding it from designers' perspectives, understanding it from retailers' perspectives, understanding it from producers and manufacturers' perspectives, those differences. And if we do make changes to labels, what are some of those unintended consequences that can potentially happen? Because if we do make suggestions or we do make recommendations moving forward, we don't want to make something that is indeed worse than what we have now, or heaven forbid, make people sick.
So Lukas, we've covered so much today. If there was just one takeaway from our discussion that you hope that our listeners will remember, what would it be?
The key thing that I would say is be mindful of the dates when we're looking at those labels. Those labels are there and they are designed to help us. They are really a useful way for us to manage food in our households, and they are useful for us to make sure that we are rotating food in our household. The key thing that I would say is be brave, particularly with best before. Use your nose, use your taste, have a look, touch the food, and try and get your head around, particularly with best before, whether the food is still edible. One of the things that we've found that comes across that's been going on in tandem with food waste in the country is that we've had good innovations that have happened. I live in the city of Melbourne, and even though we're in a highly built up area, they've brought out FOGO, so food organic waste bins, which are a terrific thing. But what we've also find with that it actually reassures consumers in the wrong way, in the fact that people see that and they say, well, if I put it in there, at least the food is actually going to be composted and used again. Our aim is to avoid putting it into that bin in the first place. So actually looking at those, but also managing the way that we purchase our foods to try and help reduce it. And it's hard. There's lots of different ways, but everything and the odds are all really stacked against us in terms of making those really clear and lucid decisions. So I've given you a really long answer to a short question. I apologize for that.
Well, Lukas, that wraps it up for today. Thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to having you back in 2025 to discuss the next steps in your project. And also, I'll make sure that all your contact details and the links to your report are available in our show notes for our listeners. So thanks for joining us today, Lukas.
Lovely. Thank you for having me on. It's been great.
And that wraps up another episode of Food Waste Matters, where we delved into the importance of clear food labelling and how understanding best before and use by dates could potentially reduce waste by helping us as consumers make informed decisions about food safety and food storage. So a big thank you to Lukas Parker for joining us and sharing his research, and most importantly, the practical actions we can take as a result of his research. And if you want to learn more about Lukas's project or get in touch with him, just go to the End Food Waste Australia website and you'll find information not only about the National Date Labelling and Storage Advice Project, but a range of other research projects all focusing on reducing food waste. Remember, every little bit counts when it comes to tackling food waste. Each one of us can make a difference. If you want to be the first to hear about our latest episodes, you can subscribe to our list at foodwastematters.com.au. And while you're there, just check out our past episodes and see what other guests have shared with us. And if you have a question, a food saving tip, or maybe you're doing something incredible in the food waste space, we'd love to hear from you. Just drop us a line at foodwastematters@honeyandfox.com.au. So thanks for tuning in, and I look forward to catching you in the next episode.